I will say we're always in a constant state of growth, right? Yeah. And we should always be in a constant state of growth, in a constant state of learning to understand, like, I'm working on these skills and I can always get better at them. To be willing to say, I know I'm not perfect, and that's okay. Yeah. And I'm going to continue to grow, and that's actually exciting.
All right, welcome to Beyond the Ping Pong Table, the podcast that delves into the heart of innovative workplace cultures that put people first. Today, I'm excited to have Nicole Ennen, founder of Org Empathy Consulting, as our guest here in the studio, live in person. Yeah. Nicole holds a master's in organizational psychology, has over a decade of industry experience, and is committed to sharing new and creative learning approaches, which I'm really excited to get into today. She's dedicated to helping organizations navigate the delicate balance between doing business and embracing the human aspect of work. Join us as we explore Nicole's approach to developing leaders, enhancing interpersonal skills among employees, and fostering a culture that truly values empathy and understanding. Welcome, Nicole.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be here and have the conversation today with you.
I've been having a lot of fun with this icebreaker question. What was your first job ever, and how old were you?
Ooh. Well, I babysat for a while when I was probably in my early teens, right? Like 15, 16, did a lot of babysitting. But my first, I would say, corporate job was at Sears. I don't know if Sears is still a company, right? You remember Sears?
I remember Sears.
I was in the shoe department. If you didn't know that Sears had a shoe department, they did. And
was there a commission?
There was not a commission.
Oh, okay.
No, and so when people were like, can you put this shoe on my foot? I'm like, I'm not... No, thank you.
So that was short-lived?
No, I did it through high school for a couple of years, like just in my, part-time job in high school, making some money. So worked at Sears. That was my first intro into the customer service life, I guess. Yeah.
Right.
Corporate life.
So walk us through a little bit about your career journey then.
Yeah. So I have a background in psychology, sociology. Mm-hmm. I've always been fascinated with just how do people interact, and like, why do I click with some folks and not with others, and how do groups of people work well together? So always interested in that social psychology aspect. Mm-hmm. And I didn't want to go and be a professor at a university and teach, so I looked at different types of opportunities, and I ended up finding industrial organizational psychology, which is just a kind of long, long title for...
What does that mean?
How do you apply like psychology and the science of, how we behave and how we work together into the workplace? Wow. So how do you hire people the right way? How do we do training, like adult learning theory? How do people work together? Like, what does leadership coaching and development look like? And how can we, build leaders that are effective and empathetic? Mm-hmm. And so what culture, values of organizations, all of these different types of things. So I went and got my master's in that at Minnesota State University, Mankato, and I love the program, still very involved with it. Actually going up to our alumni network we're having a big reunion for all the alumni over the past 30 years that have been in the program this fall. It's going to be exciting. But yeah, and so started my career in consulting at smaller firms, focused on selection, training, mentorship programs, exit surveys and interviews, why are people leaving companies and how can that data inform changes we make, right? Mm-hmm. And then ended up going into Google and worked in the people analytics, people operations department for about 3.5 years, worked on candidate experience, employee experience, career development, took a sidestep for 3.5 years, went into Google Cloud and focused on the customer-facing side of experience. So what can we do to make that better for our business-to-business customers? Mm-hmm. And recently, last year, started my own practice focused on this.
Yeah. So were you consulting at Google then, or was that?
I was an internal position, but I considered myself an internal consultant essentially. So I managed a lot of the surveys and research programs that fed into experience work, and then essentially I worked across department to be like, this is the data, and here let's work with you to figure out the recommendations and what we can actually do to build programs to make experience better for people that are going through a hiring process, people that are trying to look for a job internally but don't want to leave Google but are kind of ready to move on to something new and exciting. How do we make those pathways easier for people.
That's awesome.
And yeah, understand the programmatic aspects, kind of partnering with different departments and stakeholders. So
Nice.
yeah.
Nice. And so you spent about 7 years there?
I spent 7 years at Google. Yeah.
And what transitioned you to starting your own consulting?
Yeah, I know. It's an interesting time in tech right now.
Yeah.
So like I said, I was at Google for the first 3.5 years, worked in people analytics, then moved to Google Cloud on the customer facing side. I will say that's kind of like a detour in my career. I learned so much, had a really interesting experience, gained a lot of skills, and just got to see what things were like on the customer facing side. Also realized I wanted to get back into the people stuff, into the training, into the development. And so I was looking for kind of a change. And Google has a great program for nonprofits called .org. Long story short, I ended up getting a fellowship, which allowed me to go on a 6-month sabbatical to work on a nonprofit project where your team still pays for you to go on this 6-month sabbatical. And then 3 weeks into me starting that project, the big layoffs hit at Google in tech last year. So it was that 12,000. I know there's probably even more since that had they keep hitting tech. And so yeah, I reevaluated what do I love to do, and how do I get back to my own personal values, and how can I add something that would, help other people, right? Like I wanted to get back to that. Right? How can I feel like more connected to others? How can I help other people have those aha moments? And so doing these trainings and workshops around interpersonal skills, manager development, having groups of teams work together, that's something I've always been really passionate about, and just I get energy from that. And so in April of last year, I started my own consulting practice.
You didn't waste much time.
I didn't know.
That's
I
amazing.
know. It's like I said, I think I was in a better mental place than a lot of folks. Like I'm still running support groups for folks that got laid off last year.
Okay.
Like we meet weekly, and like I kind of lead a support group, and it's literally anybody can come. And I think
Awesome.
I was at a different place where I was mentally kind of ready to move on. I had a little bit of golden handcuff syndrome because I live in the Bay Area, and I was hoping to afford a down payment on a house at some point. And I was like, if I stay there for 10 years, maybe I can afford a down payment.
Absolutely.
And so, but I reevaluated things and, realized that I'd rather use that money, or I'd rather invest in the moment, right? And in what I actually want to do, and try to go off on my own and see how that works, and do the things that I'm passionate about. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
on that.
Thank you.
What kind of companies do you work with right now?
Honestly, it varies. So I work with some nonprofits. I work with some government organizations. I also work with private corporations. What I'm looking for, the folks that I think tend to work well with me are, where they have leaders or managers that realize something's not quite right. People are leaving my team, or there's some interpersonal conflict that I can't fix by myself. I don't understand what's going on. At an organizational level, there might be some politics, interdepartment, right? So those are, I guess, ideal clients for me, are folks that realize that something is wrong, and maybe it's making them be less profitable, less productive. Their employees are not satisfied, and maybe they're leaving at higher rates. And so folks that realize that and don't necessarily understand or can't pinpoint what the issue is, that's where I can come in and kind of look at the different situations and see what are the factors in play, and look at some interpersonal training workshop solutions to help build a stronger culture.
So how do you define an empathetic leader?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I have a process of empathy that I kind of go through with both individuals and also kind of organizations. And I'll say it really does start with you. So it starts with the person themselves, even if I'm thinking of myself as a leader, myself as a manager, but even just me as an individual, right? Relating with other people. The first step to empathy is really understanding yourself and understanding your own reactions to life, right? We all have these biases, and our brain is wired in a way to react to different stimuli, right? And so the more that we can understand how we react, how do we communicate? What's our preferred communication method? What's our work style? What are some of our personality quirks? And how do we communicate that to others. Like we can't really communicate like, hey, I prefer this if we don't actually know ourselves.
Yeah.
Or I really, I like to do this. I like to do that. I prefer a text over an email, all that, like even little things like that can make a big difference in how we interact with each other. So I think understanding yourself and that introspective part is really the first step to empathy. So that's kind of what I start with leaders and managers. It's understanding who you are, what is your leadership style, and like how do you prefer to communicate? How can you communicate that to your directs? And then also figuring out, moving into the next stages is taking that, view outside and really understanding and looking at the environment. And the first step really is active listening, right? And consideration. So truly looking at things without judgment and seeing what happens in my environment. How is this individual interacting with me? How are they experiencing this, which might be different from what I assume they're experiencing. So really listening to people and then, doing the active listening process to say, I heard this, is that correct, right? So making sure that you're really understanding what they're saying and then using that understanding to move forward and incorporating that actually into your behavior, right? So, hey, I heard that you actually prefer to be communicated to this way, or, you prefer this thing, you weren't too hot on when I did this behavior and you wanted to give me feedback on it. So I'm going to adjust my behavior and then let's have an open communication so that we can learn from each other, right? And building that trust as a manager is so important, and it takes time and it takes effort. And I feel like a lot of folks are just promoted into management because they're great at the thing that they did, right? Yeah. But being a manager and being a leader are different skill sets than what you're doing on the ground. Whether you're coding, whether you do customer service or sales, being a manager is different than those skill sets. And so it's just another thing you can learn. And I do believe it is learnable. It's teachable, right? We can learn how to be empathetic. So it's
with the active listening. I just if that's not something that you're normally attuned to doing, is that something that you try to facilitate conversations like that, or do you just try to inject it in your everyday? Like, how do you get people aware of active listening and using it with their
it's a great question. And so I say you can do it either way, right? You can even do it as micro practices. So right now, like as we're having this conversation, instead of me responding right away, I could like take a couple breaths and not think about what I'm going to say. And just be like, hey, what I heard you say was you want to understand what active listening is,
right? And
how I can input that, do we do it in big workshops? Do we do it in micro practices? How do we do it throughout, right? So like having that confirmation.
That's exactly what I was saying. Yes, you got it.
Right? And not having it be like, I need to respond, right? And I feel like as leaders too, sometimes we feel like there's a spotlight on us and that we need to be on all the time and we can't show any vulnerability or we can't, we need to be strong. We need to show like the way, but the more we're able to be open and show pieces of ourselves and take that time to say, I want to listen to you and I might not respond right away. Like people relate to that and they actually, they like, we all want to be listened to just at a core level, right? We want to be understood as humans. So the more that we can facilitate those types of conversations and micro practices, and it doesn't need to be like, I'm going to have this giant session with all my employees in a room and I'm going to actively listen to you. Tell me all the things, right? Like that's a little bit too spotlighty on everything. But even just in one-on-ones, right? Like I always encourage managers should have one-on-ones with their employees. And it should not just be on like, what's this week? What's going on? Okay, you did this, you did that, blah, 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 right? Like it shouldn't be on just the tactical stuff. Of course, that could be part of it, but it should be a trust building exercise. That's what those one-on-ones are. Like ask them, how are they doing? How can I support you, right? And actually listen to that and then incorporate that into how you're interacting with that person. And everybody's going to be different. So I say there's not one style of management necessarily that works for different, like just everybody. Your approach as a manager and leader, it's really understanding the person and then figuring out what do they need to be successful and how can I support that. So I think that's really important to treat everybody as an individual.
Yeah. Earlier in the conversation, you had mentioned that you run support groups for folks who've been laid off from their positions. And while sometimes a layoff is inevitable, what can companies or leaders within that organization be doing to better prepare, I guess, their team when something like this happens?
Yeah. So there's a lot of stuff. I think it's very interesting time where it's almost like if you have a hammer, everything's a nail. And I feel like especially a lot of industries right now are like using layoffs as their like fix-it solution to any operational budget cost savings issues, right? I'm not necessarily a financial strategy consultant, but there are a ton of them out there that could help businesses. There are other ways around this, right? There are other ways you can cut costs. There are other ways that you can figure out how to operationalize and maybe you hired too many people in the first place. Well, that was a leadership mistake, right? Like that shouldn't fall on the people. But there are a few different ways I think that companies can think through this. So first is there shouldn't be a layoff in the first place, right? And if there is a place where you need to reduce the force in certain departments, you're like, these aren't our priorities anymore. Our priorities are over here. How can you retrain or reactivate those people in a different part of the company, right? So is there that transferability that you could figure out? How can, if they need retraining, or can we actually just plug and play them into, if they're software engineers over here, can we put them over here and they can work on this other project that's a super high priority for us? So thinking more creatively about that. I also think there's some interesting approaches that some companies took, particularly during the pandemic, which was we know we have to do furloughs or we have to do layoffs. It's just inevitable. We don't have the business right now, and like especially for like travel type businesses, right? And so there were some companies that experimented with voluntary layoffs. So it was like, here's the severance package. This is how many people, we're going to need to let go. Who would like to volunteer? So instead of doing involuntary layoffs where some, leader somewhere is just like, you, what if you gave people the choice? And then you're also kind of, there's good attrition and bad attrition, right? Like you don't necessarily want people to stay that actually want to leave and that aren't going to be as productive in their roles. So if people are already like 1 foot out the door, like those people might be more likely to raise their hands in that situation, right? And then it obviously feels a lot better if the employee is able to make a choice and choose their own destiny to say, yes, I will, take this severance package and think about my options for the future versus if it was just done to them. So I think there are a lot of other ways around this if companies were willing to take the time to invest in them and think more creatively. And the cost, it might take longer for them to see the benefits of the cost, right? Because unfortunately right now, companies who do layoffs, stock price go up. Like layoff happens, stock price goes up the next day if it's a public company, which is sad. But that's kind of some of the incentive, right? And you're not going to see the stock price go up. You're going to see it steadily go up if you invest in some of these other solutions. And in the long run, there is research that shows companies who have good cultures and do practices like this that are more people focused, they have better stock prices compared to comparable companies from like 10 years ago that when they started at the same level. And I can give you some of the research if we want to put it in the show notes, but it's really interesting. It's a long-term strategy for success. And I feel like a lot of companies are just stuck in that short-term thinking right now.
It just goes back again to that empathy.
It does.
Thinking about the people.
Thinking about the people and
building that in.
Thinking about that. And it's not, again, the part is, it's not just doing what's best for the people, because it is doing what's best for your company. Because when people collaborate better, they communicate better with each other, they are invested in the mission and believe in the leaders, they're going to stay longer, be more productive for you, and make more money for you. And it's again, a long-term strategy for success that I think a lot of companies are not, they're thinking too short-sighted.
So my last corporate job was like 10 years ago, but I worked for a really great company, and they were checking in with us regularly enough that by the time your performance review, I remember my first performance review, like having my speech prepared, having my numbers of what I felt I deserved, and then didn't even have to like use any of that. Like it was like, oh yeah, no, I have been doing a good job, and that's why I'm still here. So I'd love to talk a little bit more about that, because I feel like previous jobs weren't quite like that.
Sure.
And people shouldn't dread the performance reviews.
Yeah, I mean, I think it does look different for different companies. A lot of companies do tend to do a either once or twice a year, like big rating review, right? And so it's when managers are giving their employees a rating. Sometimes it's a 360 where you gather feedback from kind of all around you, from your peers, from the folks, if you have direct reports, from those that, you manage, from like your leadership. So you get some feedback, but a lot of times it kind of occurs once or twice a year. And I think it's very fascinating because from a process standpoint, so I go to the Society of IO Psychology conference every year, and there's a ton of professionals that this is their job. They work on performance management systems. They do, like, there's PhDs that do research on performance management systems. And it was really fascinating that like 6 years ago, it was like, we need to change everything. Like we need a revolution in this. What we're doing is not working. And then I don't know, I think we just forgot about it and we're just still kind of doing the same thing, honestly. Or it's like nobody came up with something better yet. I think performance is a very hard thing to manage from a big organizational level, because a lot of those ratings then go into compensation, they go into promotions, they go into all of these different types of things. I think that there are things that we can do though as managers and leaders to make sure that we can feel confident that our employees are being rated fairly, equitably, that we're taking their full performance into account, and that we're not surprising them with feedback, right? Yeah. So I think, like I touched on before, with when somebody starts on your team, you should have you should have a job description, which honestly some jobs don't even have. But you should know what this person should be doing. Yeah. And then you should set those expectations with them. This is what I expect of you. Here are, some of the goals, and maybe you can, if they're, senior enough, maybe you can build those goals together, right? Like, this is kind of what we need to accomplish. Let's figure out how to build that plan to get there. But these are the expectations that I have for you, right? And then talk about them. And you should be checking in with those consistently, right? So checking in with them in your weekly one-on-ones, even just mentioning when you're on track, when you're not, doing like more formalized check-ins every month, doing with my direct reports that I had at Google in my last role. I did, I had weekly one-on-ones with them, and this could come up at any point. But then I also had like hour-long times that were separate every like couple of months that we would just talk about, let's not be in the weeds. Let's pull back. How are you doing overall? How can I support you in your career? And thinking through, like, what do you want in the next 5 years? Where do you want to be? And how can we set you up for success there? And then checking in on the expectations for their role to make sure that they're on track, to get a decent rating, right? And so that's something that we can do as individuals. I think that there's still, I'm not one of those people that has a PhD in performance management. So there are a lot of great folks that are coming up with great solutions out there for how companies can strategize and come up with better systems. And like, I've worked with a lot of them. And so I think there's a revolution that could be afoot if we're willing to take, to not just sit within the norm, right? But there are things we can do right now as leaders. And that's continuously like building that trust, being open to giving feedback throughout the cycle, and not having it just be a one-time thing where people are surprised at the rating or the feedback that they get, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when we were off camera, you started telling me about how you just got certified on movement
and practice.
Movement and practice.
Yeah. Well, I'm like, cross my fingers. I just finished my certification program, so I should hear in like a couple of weeks, but yeah.
So can you talk to us a little bit about that program and then how you're trying to incorporate it with your consulting business?
Yeah, of course. So the program was created by Dr. Peter Lovett and Lindsay Lovett, who are based out of the UK. And Dr. Peter Lovett calls himself Dr. Dance, or dance psychologist, and he's been doing research for decades just on how movement and dance can help us feel more connected to one another, can help us emotionally and with our well-being, and also help us think a little bit better and improvise and like brainstorm, like how movement actually affects how we think, how we feel, all of these amazing things. And so they created a program where you can essentially upskill to become a facilitator in this methodology and then apply it to your practice, your daily lives. And so yeah, I went through the certification program at the end of last year and just like submitted my final thesis. Okay. And so I'm really excited just to one, be in that community of folks that are thinking more creatively about how can we apply things to a business setting, to a nonprofit setting, to applied settings in a way that's a little bit different. So I'll give you a couple examples of how I'm thinking to use this. It's like when I do workshops with teams where we're trying to break down these barriers and we're understanding what norms do we have that are not effective? Like what behaviors are we doing that aren't effective, right? Like maybe our weekly meeting, everybody is just tuned out and doing something else. Like, but it's a norm. So we just keep having that meeting. Like, how do we have that conversation about, is that effective? And should we not do it? And like breaking down those, barriers of defensiveness that we might have with one another. How do we use movement to actually grease the wheels of that? So how can we do some movement exercises within some of these team building workshops with like the research that, indicates that when we move in sync with other people, we kind of like actually feel a little bit closer to them, and like some of the walls with defensiveness come down. It also helps with our well-being. And a lot of us who work in office type jobs are chronically still. Like we just don't move. We're at our computers. We're not up and down, especially if we work hybrid or maybe from home. Like we're just, we might never leave our computer. So how do we even just get some movement breaks and get our bodies moving again? So we kind of reset back to like our body's emotional baseline. And then we can be more present in the conversations we're having instead of being distracted by all of these different things that, very stressful, right? We have a lot of stuff on our mind most of the time. Most of us do. And so how do we actually just make ourselves more present in the moment and being able to relate to other people? So I'm really excited to see how I can build some of those movement practices into the type workshops or with teams, but also with managers and individuals on how they can build micro practices in their day to reset them emotionally to show up better as leaders.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just joined a hip hop class, so like I could totally like dance has always been a way I love to express myself.
Yeah.
And I remember going first day feeling like, how am I gonna look in a mirror at myself in front of all these people? But then now that wall is down and like the camaraderie in that class and the encouragement that we all give each other. I mean, if that's anything like that, I can totally understand and relate to that right now.
Totally, right? And I feel like there's that barrier of and Dr. Peter Lovett has talked about this too throughout the program, and even with their work with organizations, it's like breaking down that barrier of people being worried about, oh, well, dance, whatever, that's just too frou-frou, or that can't work for us.
Yeah.
But I've seen him get in front of a group of 10,000 people at like a conference and make everybody dance, and the entire room is just invigorated and energized after it, and like you can see how much of an impact it does have, right? Once you do it. And I feel like it's just for people who are willing to experiment and maybe go outside the box a little bit. And obviously I can adjust. It's not like I'm going to bring in hip hop or bring in ballet or some like intensive dance to like a corporate setting. Even small movements with like your arms, or even just like getting up. It doesn't even have to be dance, right? It could just be like, let's walk around the room together and see how do we actually walk? Do we walk in sync? Like usually sometimes when people walk together, they'll actually start walking in sync with like steps, right? In a circle. It's just very interesting thinking through how does some of our interactions come out in movement in a different way.
Yeah. I feel like I need to have like a routine before I do my podcast.
I love that. I'm trying to build more movement exercises into my just daily life, right? Like when I'm at a computer for 4 hours working on a training or something and I'm just in it, it's like, you got to get up. Let's just get up and turn on a minute of music and just dance. And like, it really does reset your body. It resets your mind. It helps kind of release, your cortisol, just like high stress hormones. It helps you get rid of some of that and just come back into your body, right?
Yeah. So. I love that. So you're an artist as well. And I want to know more about how that ties into creativity and connection for you with your clients.
Yeah, so I've been doing art my whole life, I guess. And it's something that has been it's a release for me, right? It's kind of like, it's my meditation almost, right? Is making. And I also am on the board of a local nonprofit called Harmony Works. And we do a lot of like performance and community-based stuff. And so like singing and being able to kind of do all of that is really just like a release for me. And so I am very, especially taking this movement program and being certified in movement and practice and getting that incorporated, I'm continuously thinking through how can I bring that creativity and those creative approaches into the workplace. Because especially with, I don't know, if you think about normal corporate training type stuff, it's like,
it's a drag.
Yeah, right? It's let me talk at you for 3 hours and you're just probably going to zone out. Or here's this e-learning that you have to like click through after 30 seconds passes, but you're probably like doing your email, right? Like how do we make some of those things more effective so people, and using creativity, using either the act of creation, using movement in practice, using like the performance type of thing, using music. How do we bring those concepts into have people connect with it, right? At kind of a more visceral level to some of these concepts and be, again, in the moment, bring people into the moment of like the workshop and not have all these things that they're thinking about and worried about, but like they're so integrated and excited and feel like they're interacting with things that they actually like pick up the concepts better. So I'm really excited to figure out how can I partner my creative side with the creation into doing some more of these like experimental interactive workshops in the workplace.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting because it's like I said, like allowing people to have, like, how do you create without putting people on the spot? Like, how do you allow people to open up in organizations? Like, how do you facilitate that? How can we naturally kind of, I don't know, tap into what our team's interests are or desires or creativity?
Yeah. And again, I'm going to go back to active listening and and empathy and understanding, right? So it really goes back to, do you understand their communication, what they prefer. And as you build trust with people, and a manager, as we build trust with people, like they'll be more comfortable sharing some stuff with us, right? And like, oh, hey, this is my interest outside of work, or I'm going to this, I'm going to go do ceramics after work, or I'm going to go pick up my kids from soccer practice and I'm going to go do this, right? And so we're able to build that similarity, and there's, understanding of like, oh, hey, we have similar interests, or, oh, wow, that's fascinating, I want to learn more about that. And then how can we start, building that into, once you understand what people like, okay, well, what activities or what types of things could we do together to bond and create that trust?
Yeah. And I love, again, that the active listening, that might end up being part of the title. Empathy and active listening, because... And
I mean, I'm not great at it sometimes either, right? Like we all can work on these things. And even me as like, empathy, active listening, it's like sometimes I realize like, at home with my partner, I'm like, wow, I did not listen. Like I need to take a step back and, or just realize too, when am I not at a point to receive like information and be able to communicate that, like, hey, I would love to have this conversation. I'm just emotionally not there right now. Like I can't intake anything more. I had a rough day. Like, can we have this conversation tomorrow? Right. Yeah. And so I think it's understanding, again, goes back to understanding yourself and understanding when you're able to have the capacity to do the emotional labor and emotional intelligence that is needed for interaction, right?
Yeah. I've even found that after hosting this podcast now, like I've been expanding my team as of this past couple of weeks. And cool. And there's a lot of email, text message correspondence. And I keep, like, before I hit send, I'm like, no. That doesn't sound right.
Let's pad it.
Yeah, let's pad it up a little bit. I'm a nice person, and I would assume that's what they're hearing. But I've known in the past, I've been told in the past, and if you ask any of my sisters and some of my best friends, sometimes I'm a little too quick to respond out of efficiency. And I found that, like, wait, I should really, I tap into an episode or something I learned about leadership, and I'm like, okay, wait, if I can give this feedback a little bit differently and maybe a little extra follow through, and then just checking in, it's like things I thought I did, but not as intentionally. And so
I think that
coming up for me a lot.
It does, and that goes back to understanding your audience and who you're interacting with, right? And just figuring out, like, okay, maybe somebody will interpret this one way, but another person will interpret the same exact message a completely different way. And it is hard because when we're not in person, which a lot of us text, we have virtual calls, we have all this stuff, and we don't have the body language, we don't have the tone of voice, we don't have all these other markers that helps us understand how people, like, you know, what they're trying to communicate, right?
Yeah.
And so making sure that we explain, this is what I meant, you know, in a different way, or understand who we're talking to.
Yeah.
Like for, you know, even in sharing our pet peeves, like if somebody just texts me back K, like instead of like, all right, or sounds good, I think that they hate me. And like, I know people do that all the time, but it's a thing that like, I don't know why it triggers me, but it does. Right. And so like, I communicate that with people. I'm like, hey, that like, are you mad at me? And they're like, no, why? And I'm like, because you just sent one letter.
Yeah.
And so like,
and we hold on to that. Like, you're like, yeah.
Right. And then it's like, oh no, gosh, does that person hate me? But it's understanding, like, okay, that's a trigger for Nicole, so maybe I don't send her K, I send her sounds good, or message received, like something else, right? That gets the same thing across. So I think, again, it's to understanding your audience and your communication and their communication and figuring out a collaboration in between.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember like when I was a manager, like I remember some of the training we did there even, and I remember reading 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. Do you know that book?
Yep.
I love that book. Quick read. And like, I remember like thinking, oh, I could really like apply this to, at the time, my husband, we were dating, you know, but like I was like, there's a lot of like tactical tips here that I can be using at home too. It all goes.
It does.
Yeah. It's life.
It's life, right? And I mean, I will say we're always in a constant state of growth, right? Yeah. And we should always be in a constant state of growth, in a constant state of learning to understand, like, I'm working on these skills and I can always get better at them. I can always understand myself better. I can always understand other people better, right? So it's not thinking of anything as static and having that growth mindset too, to be willing to say, I know I'm not perfect, and that's okay. Yeah. And I'm going to continue to grow. And that's actually exciting, right, for us. Yeah. So,
yeah. Well, Nicole, this has been such an enlightening conversation. And I love everything you're doing. Where can people find you?
Yeah. So my website is www.organizationalempathy.com. Okay. And so you can find me there. I do have a bunch of resources and blog posts that you can, just look at for free. Yep. You can also reach out. I have like 30-minute free consultations.
Awesome.
If you're, interested, especially I'm looking for clients right now who are interested in doing like their leadership, or they understand that something is wrong. We don't know what, but we're willing to work on it. And we want to work better together, and we want to, be better managers for our people, or my team wants to work better together.
Yeah.
And also looking for people who might be willing to do some of those more interactive, innovative approaches, like including movement, including other creative practices to figure out how we can work better together and build that into our daily interactions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm sure every interaction with clients is almost customized to what their organization
is. Yeah. And I think that's one of the benefits of working with me, a one-person shop, is that I am very high touch, and I essentially tailor the workshop and the program to your needs. Like I might have a base program that I have, but everything can be tailored based on what your team needs, based on what your manager needs, and, based on like what your organization as a whole needs. Yeah.
And you're based in the San Francisco Bay Area, but I'm assuming you're able to work with folks
so
from all over.
I do a lot of, virtual workshops now, especially with, companies having a lot of hybrid and virtual work. So definitely open to in-person or virtual hybrid type options of things. I've worked with people across the world. So
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. It was a great conversation.
So much fun.